Ah, yes. Here we are again. The happy Hob on the cusp of losing yet another bet. If he loses this one, he'll have to jump off the Stratosphere Tower in Las Vegas. A jump of 855 feet, in what he'll hope that he'll land safely. But that got me thinking, what if, and purely hypothetically of course, what if his bungee were to snap? And he were to plummet to his untimely demise and smash to smithereens? It would be quite unfortunate indeed. The world would lose an incredible staller. But let's put this into a little different perspective, shall we? So here's the tower here. If Hob were to jump off from a height of 855 feet, or for you in the metric system, that's about 260 meters, they would fall all the way down to the ground, which we'll call down here as 0. How fast would he be traveling just before impact? How fast? Well, physicists have an equation as the final speed squared equals the initial speed squared minus 2 times the strength of gravity times the change in height. So, if he were to jump off from this upper platform, right, he would jump outwards a little bit and fall down. But if you've ever taken a physics class, you will know that motion horizontally is purely independent from motion vertically. Thus, this equation is in the vertical direction, which I'll denote by putting subscripts here, right? His initial vertical speed is 0. He's simply stepping off the platform and falling down. So, his initial speed is 0. And that leaves us able to solve for the final speed in the y direction as minus 2 times g is 9.81 times the change in height, well, that's final minus initial, or 0 minus 260. And we have to take the square root of all that. And that leaves us with a speed of about 71.5 meters per second. Or this equals roughly 257 kilometers per hour, or 160 miles per hour. This is really fast. It would hurt if you were to smack something going 160 miles an hour, right? So that got me thinking, if Hob were to be standing still, what would an equivalent force be if it were to come along and smack him in the face? That got me thinking. In order to do that, we need to use another equation that physicists use called the impulse, and it's written as J. Don't ask me why. So the impulse is known as the force, or some force, that's acted on an object over some time. So force times time. And that is the same as an object's change in momentum. In this case, Hobbs' momentum will be going from a very high rate, right, a very large momentum, to basically 0, very, very quickly. So, the change in momentum is known as mass times speed. In this case, the final speed minus mass times the initial speed. Okay? And this is during impact. So when his body is being smashed to smithereens by the ground, body parts flying everywhere, what's the change in impulse? What's the force equivalent on his body? Well, we can solve for the force here. The final speed after impact, well, there won't be any more Hob, hypothetically, of course, so we can treat that as 0. And this leaves us with a negative mass times initial speed over time. Now, we need to make some assumptions here. We don't know Hobbs' mass. We don't know the time. We do know the initial speed. That's what I just calculated up here, right? Just before impact. So, I asked Hob yesterday in chat how much he weighed. And he told me that he weighs 200 kilograms. Now, if you know anything about, mass and weight, you know they're not the same, but that's okay. So let's take him at his word. If he weighs 200 kilos, by the way, he hides it well, it's mostly muscle. 200 kilos, that's a tremendous amount of mass, right? Well, let's see what the equivalent force is if he were to strike the ground. Let's see. Oh, by the way, that negative sign, that's simply the force of the ground going up, right? It's all the same force. So we can treat that as an absolute value and just take the magnitude. So if we put in 200 for his mass times the speed that he hits the ground at, 71.5, divided by a time. How long do you think it'll take for the ground to completely obliterate Hob? Hypothetically, of course. Well, I put in 1/10 of a second. It's not going to take very long. This gives us a force on Hob's poor fragile body, hypothetically of course, of 143,020 newtons. And so to put this in pounds, this is roughly 32,000 pounds of force on Hob's poor fragile body in just 1/10 of a second. That's an incredible amount of force. Now, I don't think he's really 200 kilos. I think he's more like 160 pounds, right? Which turns out to be roughly, if I did my calculations correct, about 72.5 kilos, roughly. So if we use that mass, this force is now approximately, of course, 51,900 newtons, which works out to about 11,600 pounds of force. Still quite considerable. Now, 11,600 pounds of force, that's a lot. 11,600 pounds of force divided by, let's see, what hits pretty hard? Mike Tyson hits pretty hard. And in fact, I looked it up. Mike Tyson has been estimated to hit with a force of up to 6,300 newtons. So, that in pounds is roughly 1,420 pounds of force. So if we divide one by the other, we get roughly 8.2 times Mike Tyson's punch strength. 8.2. Yes, Hob. If you strike the ground, jumping off the Stratosphere Tower, you strike the ground going 71.5 meters per second. That's equivalent to Mike Tyson punching you 8 times simultaneously. 8 times at the same time. Or to put it in slightly different terms, it's the same as, well, a Vauxhall Corsa striking you in the face, traveling about 18.6 kilometers per hour or 11.5 miles per hour. With that, I hope you get a little bit better perspective as to what you're up for, as to what you're up against, and I wouldn't worry too much. Those bungee cords are probably safe. Anyway, hope you get the run.